Has anyone here ever been a soldier fighting against the US? What was it like? Story 1. I was just a 7-year-old kid when my parents were watching CNN and BBC while I was playing video games. It was about some army jets taking off during the night. My dad turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It has begun. Get to the basement now." Sometime later, the first explosions could be heard. The NATO and US bombing of Serbia in '99 had started. I remember spending time in the basement with other residents. I remember how the building shook when the bombs exploded, the fear of what was coming after the sirens went off. They destroyed all 3 bridges across the Danube in my city, cutting us off from a part of our family. One day a bomb hit the refinery, so we couldn't stay in the basement anymore because of CO2. Then a bomb hit about 100 meters from our building, and shrapnel went through the blinds and windows and embedded itself into the opposite wall of our neighbor's flat. That's when we decided to move somewhere where the Americans had nothing to aim for, a smaller town. We were safer there, but we could still hear the jets flying above us and bombs going off in the distance. When someone shot down the F-117 stealth jet, it was a huge hell yeah moment for Serbia. That's my short story about surviving a war versus USA. Story 2. In World War II, the Germans, and some of our allies, often commented on how chaotic the US Army appeared to be. I believe the quote was, "War is chaos, and the American Army practices it on a daily basis." Other armies were slow, disciplined, methodical, etc. The perception was that Americans were unpredictable and undisciplined, but prone to ingenuity. Not just our generals, but right down to the grunt soldier level. I understand most who fought us viewed this as a great strength. I remember reading an article a while back that one of the reasons Americans were so unpredictable to Europeans was the fact that we were one of the first national armies to use guerrilla tactics, and then we literally got a masterclass fighting the various Indian wars. Story 3. I had the opportunity to be an opposing force, pretend baddies for special operations, spec ops raid one night recently. We all had basic roles to play to make sure the good guys got to practice at typical scenarios, but we were allowed to do whatever we wanted within the confines of the role we were given. My role was to be a squirter from the main target building. When the raid rolled up, I was to fire off some rounds and bolt as fast as possible over a hilly area and take up cover in an adjacent building. Then, when and if they came to my building, try to light up as many good guys as possible before being shot. The blacked out Hummers roll up, and I unload my rounds. After emptying a mag, I bolt for the second building. I'm not usually a nervous type of person, but it was either the sprint or the fact that those Hummers were really terrifying. But my heart rate didn't slow down after I'd stopped running. I remember thinking of 2 things. First, how strange it was that I was so scared since I knew we were using simulation and this was a war game. And second, I knew for a fact that I was going to die. I was outnumbered and outmatched. They had night vision and I was armed with a single AK-47. The sense of dread was really vivid, and I remember imagining noises and sights and kept playing out an operator sneaking up behind me in my mind. The next surprising thing was when they rolled up to my building. They weren't sneaky or silent as I imagine in books, just as before, yet they also weren't yelling at each other, as I had learned from cop shows when they clear rooms. They were all talking to each other in calm voices and using first names, relaying information about the current situation in a methodical manner. I had left the light at one corner of the building in hopes that I could spring a trap from the other corner. I turned the corner and unloaded a mag as fast as possible at the parked Hummer, barely aiming. All I could think about is the 10 to 20 guns all silently hunting from the slightest movement. Then, and I'll never forget this, I saw the eeriest sight imaginable. A red dot, bigger than I'd pictured or ever seen at the range, raced across the sand toward me. As I threw in a new mag and turned the other direction to check my 6, I had just enough time to catch the second red dot repeating the first's move as if they were synchronized divers. I've never been more impressed and mortified in my life. The next thing I felt was pretty surreal. In short, I was hit in the chest and in the back at the exact same moment by 2 operators rounding the side of the building. I was in a corner. As I retreated from one side of the building to the other, fearing the first shooter, I ran directly into his counterpart. Their bullets, simulation, contacted me at approximately the same place in my chest and my back. I listened to them clear the inside of the building. Those same cool methodical voices, first names, nothing like what I imagined. Then they searched my dead body. They began to take off my mask, paintball-type contraption, to ID my face. And the plastic was cutting into my eyebrow, so I reached up to help them take it off without hurting me. One of the operators standing watch over me almost shot me, and politely asked me to inform them verbally of any other movements I would make. Anyway, to wrap this long story up, afterward I met all the guys that were on the op. There were about 20. They were all smart as hell. Many of them had gone to college and enlisted anyway, in order to join Spec Ops. Several of them spoke multiple languages, and none of them were what I imagined. They were humble, completely professional, and extremely thankful for us volunteers that they lit up. Basically, I don't know how it would feel to fight US soldiers with real ammo. It made me pray I never will. It seemed pointless. These guys weren't practicing with air support that night. It would have been even more terrifying with that on my mind. Also, a friend of mine who is an operator wasn't sure why they'd have red dots equipped while using night vision goggles. I have no idea. I just know what I saw. Maybe it was an intimidation factor? I don't know. It almost made me shit myself. Story 4. My father was a sniper during the bombardment in Yugoslavia, and my best friend's father was a member of the elite unit called Tigers while the war in Kosovo was raging. I'll be short because I have to sleep, but my father told me it was like trying to repel a wave on the beach by building a castle out of the sand. You fought, and you may have won some small encounters, be it by accident or pure luck, but you always knew that if they wanted, they could just kill us all and be done with it. Not a nice time for Yugoslavia, that's for sure. Story 5. My grandfather was conscripted to fight for the North Korean military during the Korean War. He was at the Battle of Incheon, and he likened the dread that he felt to what one must feel when faced with a massive tidal wave that is about to engulf you and everyone you know. Couple this with the fact that many North Korean troops were told horror stories, that the American troops were cannibals, for example, and that the average American Marine was much taller and more physically robust than the average North Korean soldier. You can imagine how scared he was. He said that the Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated and that they never stood a chance against the Marines. All his words, not mine. Story 6. I'm a sapper in the Australian Army, and I've spent months living out bush performing enemy party, basically OPFOR. We wore different uniforms, usually Vietnam olive drab or desert cams, grew beards, and lived like insurgents. So one does pick up the thought patterns of a soldier fighting a coalition army. Half the day was spent killing time, reading, talking smack in politics, playing cards, eating rations, and the rest was combat and cereals. So we'd march out to a position and hit the soldiers' troop harbor at night, probing, trying to capture weapons, in packs or being challenged and bumping them with a few rounds before withdrawing. The majority of the combat tasks were during the day, however. We'd perform ambushes and conduct prisoner, wounded, and surrendering serials. One thing that was surprising was how often soldiers, particularly officer cadets, would commit war crimes. Clear violations of the laws of armed combat. Most of them were accidental, a few not. One example was I observed a scout and then withdrew to the edge of a clearing until I had a visual of the rest of the section. I bumped a few rounds, then waited for them to advance with fire and movement while my partner moved around the rear. Once they were within 40 meters of my position, then I would display that I had surrendered, rifle raised above my head or hands up shouting, "Next schießen!" Almost consistently, I was shot after they ceased fire by one of the members of the section. Commonly one would fire and the rest would open up. And twice I was clearly executed, at close distance and verbal contact, then shot with blanks. This is training, but it was surprising. The chaos of a firefight would create a friendly or enemy mentality, and no gray zone emerged for wounded combatants or surrendering parties. Also factoring in trigger-happy 18-year-olds, and a pure training environment may account for this. But still, it was interesting. We also did civilian interactions, with no weapons and us wearing Hawaiian shirts and jeans. 50% we'd be lit up, and 50% they would challenge and conduct prisoner handling. Thoughts on being an enemy was being how men in pairs against a section, we were able to observe the enemy for a while, follow and note how they perform. The majority were very professional. In the bush, a section, 8 men in 2 squads including a signaler with radio, 2 machine gunners, 2 scouts, etc., is rather loud even when they're trying to be cautious. Also, despite the odds, an enemy who opens an engagement might hit 2 or 3 before the rest of the section advances and can close and kill. I noted also how you can exploit Western ROE, rules of engagement. Like in one position, I opened up from a tree on an advancing unit. I got at least 4 of a section, then I surrendered, fell out of the tree. It was a bad fall. Here I was able to eliminate half a section and due to the rules of war be captured and remain alive. Chances are, if I wasn't shot, I'd be fed, clothed and sheltered after killing 4 of their countrymen. Interesting thought when I reflect on a real-world example. Story 7. My great-uncle fought on the German side of World War II. He fought all over the place. Africa, Italy, and a small stint in Russia, and he defended France from the D-Day invasion. He was later able to move to the United States as a war refugee. He said that all of his officers would constantly tell him, when you're fighting the Americans, you must think of the least possible way they will attack you, because that will be the way that they attack you. He also said that when you were fighting Americans more so than any other country's army he fought, you had to have eyes in the back of your head. Story 8. While I cannot speak from experience, I'm an American, and I can relay something my father mentioned to me a few years ago. He was a Marine during the conflict in Grenada, and he was also active during the First Gulf War. He has never gone into great detail about his combat history, and frankly, I wouldn't want to have him rewalk those memories. But he did mention one time how you can see a man's fear before you see him. Kind of cryptic, I know, but that one statement says a lot.
He mentioned how you could hear them yelling and that the yells were not the confident kind. He meant that these men knew they were about to fight Americans. With all their fancy toys and extreme training, they knew that the Marines were coming to kill them. My dad always told me that one of the greatest weapons our military has is the image that we conjure in the minds of our enemies. While it is one thing to fight someone who you feel is an equal or less match to you, it is a completely different scenario to fight someone who you truly feel is a monstrous force of war. I can't speak for the other branches strictly because I don't have a close personal relationship with someone who's enlisted, and I have never enlisted. However, I can tell you that my father and all of his Marine buddies are absolutely vicious if prodded into an aggressive situation. Story 9. My great-uncle fought for the Germans in the Battle of Normandy. He said that they were told that the Allies were being pushed back into the sea, and that any Allies they saw were most likely small units that had slipped by. A few days later, my great-uncle woke up to find a regiment of Americans camped within sight of the farmhouse they were in. He and his squad surrendered. Story 10. Former active Army infantry here. Not sure how I'd feel if I met someone who told me they were former JAM, Jaish al-Mahdi. There were dozens of different armed groups fighting each other and fighting the coalition forces at the same time. The first deployment, it was mostly the Mahdi army. On the one hand, a lot of them were poor unemployed kids with zero prospects for employment or education. The only possible option for them was to grab a rifle and show up with the rest of the ski masks and run into coaxial machine gun fire, or dig a hole for $20 and get blown apart by an Apache. So I have some empathy for the plight of the poor, uneducated, unemployed Shiite youth who took up arms to fight the imperialist stormtrooper invaders. Sure, yeah, if Red Dawn happened, I'd be in the woods with the Wolverines too. Roger that. On the other hand, kidnappings, torture, rape, execution, burning of the Sunnis out of their homes, corruption of the police force, and the 3 dead preteens we found kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. The 10-year-old kid was shot in the head right in front of me by a sniper. The 90-plus civilian murder victims we found just in the first month of our combat tour. The kid whose tongue they cut out because he liked to chat with us when we rolled by his neighborhood. The fact that Muqtada al-Sadr is now an officially recognized member of the Iraqi government. So yeah, I can't do it. I can't forgive them. Story 11. My great-grandfather talked to me about being a Canadian in World War II. When a Canadian plane flew overhead, the Germans dove for cover. When a German plane flew overhead, the Canadians dove for cover. When an American plane flew overhead, everybody dove for cover. Story 12. My family is Panamanian. Being a civilian in a country invaded by US troops is terrifying. Tanks stopped in front of my grandma's house and started firing over it once. The cousins were all really young when it happened and they were absolutely terrified. Unfortunately, I don't have access to someone who may have fought for Noriega, the dictator at the time that the US was ousting. Story 13. Not the enemy, but was in communications. We would get intel from counter-intel guys from intercepted cell phone calls. Taliban was scared shitless when it came to engaging Marines. One report that I remember well was a commander ordering guys to engage in firefights because they wanted to do a show of force. The guy who was ordering gave a million excuses and was scared of the new Marines because they thought we were special forces. We had a bunch of new gear, chest rigs, radios, and thermals. They ended up engaging a patrolator that week. We killed most of their cell that day. Story 14. My girlfriend has family that fought against the US. The fighters didn't have any choice. They were taken from their families. Then they were trained and brainwashed. If they were to disobey, they would be killed on the spot. Some of the fighters escaped, but others weren't so lucky. The escapees were often captured, interrogated, and tortured. Pretty much what I'm getting at is that these people didn't have a choice. If they were educated in the politics of the situation, they would have gladly joined the US, but they were dogs in a chain. Story 15. I'm actually a former US Army. I spent an entire summer serving as an Op-4, opposing force at one of the Army's elite training centers. Basically, I fought US soldiers in a giant simulation. I'd actually agreed to some extent with the pushover comments for some units. The US Army is just so damn massive, some units certainly would look completely incompetent. Also, outside of a few special operations units and light infantry, there isn't a whole lot of emphasis placed in toughness. However, combat arms units are no freaking joke. We have the best, most expensive training in the world and by far the best equipment. I would not want to be on the other team. Chances are I'd be dead before I even saw an American soldier. Another former US Army Op-4 soldier here. I spent 6 years doing this, though not 6 months. I worked in Germany, so I not only got to work with the US, but most of the European NATO forces in some capacity over the 6 years. Most of my work was with mechanized forces, but I was light infantry by trade. It wasn't often that we got to do light infantry work, but I would do as many recon missions as I could to get out of the tin box that we had to run around in. Now, keep in mind I was there in the mid to late 90s, and things like experience have changed a lot since then with all the deployments the military has seen over the years. Back then, we would primarily work with units stationed in Europe. They had a huge disadvantage. They were in our backyard, they didn't get field time as we did. We averaged 300 plus days a year in field, so they were not as skilled as us. Most of the units in Europe didn't have much for training facilities other than the once or twice a year they came to work with us. Units in the US I feel would put up a little better fight. At times we would work with the Special Operations Units, SOF, Rangers, and such, and as you would expect, there was a night and day difference. They had better equipment, were better motivated, and had larger training budgets. This made them a tougher fight, but I will leave it at that. A lot of time the political side of things would step in. This would happen when other people may be watching, or things would happen remotely because we were doing a little too good. I lost count of how many times a general would step in and cancel an artillery strike that I called in because it would take out too many of his people. At first, I would get pissed, but later I realized that by denying my strike, they would get to continue to fight a little longer and maybe a little more training out of it rather than have to sit on the sidelines and watch, because I took them out right as they crossed the star line. As for other countries that I worked with, while we were in Germany, we didn't fight the Germans very often. We would train with them, and there were a couple of units that would come out in the field with us. It was rare that we would actually fight them. When they would come to our training facility, they would bring 2 units and fight each other typically. Since they had to pay the US to train at our facility to include all our fuel, ammo, and such, they realized they could better spend their money by training 2 of their units at the same time by fighting each other. When Kosovo was going on, we did run a German unit that was deployed through the process, and they were shocked that they got wiped out so quickly. I am talking quickly like we took an armored battalion in about 25 seconds from first contact to being combat ineffective. They then brought in their top armored battalion to fight us, and while they did a little better, they still didn't stand much of a chance. The Brits, we would work with once a year usually. It was expensive to bring them to Germany, so it wasn't very often. They were pretty good. I would rate them a little better than the US forces that were stationed in Germany, and likely on par with that of US stationed US forces. Probably the country that we would train the most was the Dutch army. They were a trip. You could really see where the difference is between an all-volunteer military and one that has conscripts. We would like to work with them as it was something different, and we would get a good laugh about things they would do. We'll never forget when I was the track commander as we were on an attack. Here is this Dutch truck coming down the road. It stops, backs up a couple of feet, and stops again. The next thing I see is all the occupants jumping out and running for their lives. They just left the truck in the middle of the road. Story 16. My great-uncle flew A6M0 Zeke fighter aircraft for the Japanese Imperial Navy. He survived one attack on an American carrier task force, but was wounded and relegated to light duty in China. He described the first time seeing the US fleet, circa 1944, as both awe-inspiring and extremely disheartening, simply the futility of trying to fight the US. Story 17. I actually played paintball against the US Marines once. It was scary stuff. They were in New Zealand as embassy guards and completely destroyed us during the attack. However, they couldn't play defend the flag very well.